Hello and welcome to the CVP Studios. Welcome to our kit session 102. Today's going to be really key, something very close to my heart, using your camera to tell a story. My name is Jeremy Humphreys. I'm a director of photography. Also, I'm owner of my company, Skills to Film. Like last session, we're going to have questions. I've got a monitor on my left here. Please feel free to ask as many as you like. I'll try and fit in as many as I can. And we're going to run the session for 30 minutes or so. So let's get going. Stories. It's what we all like. We read them and have them read to us from the cradle to the grave. It's what we're programmed to respond to. From cave paintings, to paintings themselves, to books, to movies and to films. To actually emotionally engage our audience with the camera is what our job is actually involved in doing when we're operating the camera. How do we engage our audience? How do we actually make them think about our shots the day after, the week after? How do we get an emotional response? That's what we're going to be talking about today. How to engage your audience with your camera, how to tell them the story that they remember, how to create an emphasis, an atmosphere, even an intimacy. When I'm training, I actually use the analogy of a railway track. On one side, I have the tech. On the tech, it's just how to expose, how to find focus, how to get the camera level. It's the basic stuff. And on the other side of my railway track, I have the story. This is the key stuff. One leads to the other. We can't have one with the other. We tell the story, and when we talk about telling story, we actually engaging the subconscious of our viewers. In a minute, I'm going to talk to you about the key techniques and the key components of that emotional engagement. A quick story first. Again, when I'm running my training, I'm actually talking often about a series producer. First thing on the Monday morning, one of you shot a taster tape. That series producer possibly hasn't had time to look at your footage over the weekend. They're just coming in on a Monday morning, looking at their iPad, think, oh, I haven't managed to look at it, I'll quickly look at it now, or have that meeting in 5-10 minutes. How you've lit that taster tape, how you've framed it in terms of your composition, what colour you've actually dialed in on the camera, and what depth of field, what's in focus or what isn't, are the essential emotional components of what I use day in and day out to engage. You use some or all of those components on your taster tape, and that series producer or your viewer or even yourself when you play back your footage will be engaged. And it's that emotional engagement I want to talk about today. Light. How we light somebody is crucial to how the viewer will actually be engaged. Let me show you something on this camera. Dark and light. Contrast engages the human brain. Flatly lit objects, we don't have the same response to. It's why when I'm lighting, I don't have the sun behind the camera. I always have the sun slightly behind. The face is oval. It responds very well to modeling. You can see here I'm brighter on this side of my face than I am on this side of my face. We like looking at people or images that have contrast. Contrast, the difference between light and dark. Think about how we could use that. I do a lot of my interviews by windows. By windows, we have daylight. Daylight in itself, by the way, is a natural engager. We like looking at things in daylight or people or objects lit by daylight. You've got daylight a lot of the time when you're filming, so let's use it. So as I say, I often film people by a window, not necessarily with the window behind, that might be too bright, but very much with the source of light being the window to one side. And that's how I create my modeling. Now, all of it, of course, depends on what is your story. 10 years or so ago, I did a documentary on a lady. She'd been having a tough time in life, various relationship issues, and she actually would spend a lot of her time standing by the window, Photographically, it helped me tell that story perfectly. One side of her face was in bright light from the window, from the street outside. The other side was in darkness, similar to what mine is now, light and shade. Before she'd even opened her mouth, before she'd even spoken, I, as a viewer, was engaging in that because, as I say, we are interested in contrast. Now, contrast can work for you and against you. Too much contrast, and it can be extreme. It might not fit your story. It might be more of a light-beated story than one I've just given you the example. It might be something where somebody's just won a prize or where somebody's happy. Their contrast can probably be less. But where you have contrast, we have that engagement. And I've also got here, I carry it on every location, my faithful reflector. If you do light by a window, and you have no artificial lights, but you do feel the contrast is just a little bit too great on one side of the face, then you're able to bring the reflector in there. Look, I'm just using the reflector to use the light on my right to give a bit more light on the side. Those that are interested in lighting, the brightest light is called the kicker, and this light just glancing on the side of my face is called a kicker, K-I-C-K-E-R, kicker. It just helps model my face from the light to the dark in the middle to the light on the kicker side on the back of my head. I'm often asked with the reflector whether we should use silver or white. White is more common. White avoids dazzling somebody when you're using it to reflect light back into their face. Silver we tend to use more from behind where nobody's going to be dazzled because it's behind, and also where you want more of an intense light. The other thing I'll say as well, that with dark skin, the kicker, particularly on the silver side, works extremely well. It really glances the side of the face, as I say, acts as a kicker, and gives a lovely relief between the dark in the middle and the dark on the side. By bringing in the kicker, it just gives you that shape and form. Really important in terms of actually using contrast. Back to the camera over here. In addition to actually using the reflector, sometimes we end up actually having to supplement light. I do use artificial light. I should say often it's the lights I turn off rather than the lights I turn on. I use daylight wherever I can, and if there's artificial light going on in the room as well, I often turn that light off and just model as I showed you with the reflector. Sometimes we haven't got enough daylight though, so the light I use, very, very important this, I supplement. What do I mean by supplementing? Well, I supplement in terms of I either use the light to replace the reflector, or if I'm filming in a living room or I'm doing an interview in a room where there are lights, I use those lights in my shot to actually simulate lighting in the background. Recently, I've been doing something with candlelight, and I've had candles dotted everywhere. So to actually hint to your audience, to actually engage your audience when you are lighting them, show them the source of light. Use a candle if that fits the scene, or if there's a normal domestic light behind you, use that in shot as well. And by using the light to actually supplement, it becomes more believable. This engaging of the audience is helped by making things believable. Hence, filming people by windows. We often stand by windows, it makes sense. But that contrast and that modeling is very important. And this leads us on to dynamic range. Dynamic range is the cameras behind me, their ability to actually record a wide range of contrast, to give you detail in the shadows and the highlights. And that ability to record the dynamic range with the camera basically gives you the opportunity to film in a wide range of contrast. So you may not need to light as much as you thought. And of course, with the FS7, one of the cameras behind me, Sony call it an immersive experience. What do they mean by immersive experience? By immersive experience, for me, the way I interpret that, as a DOP, I think the camera has got as close to what it can see, the camera has got as close to what the human eye can see than a number of cameras have gone before it. That's fantastic for us as camera operators and producers of movie and TV, because it means the camera is actually replacing the human eye. And if we're actually replacing the human eye, we can actually simulate what the human eye would normally see. That engagement is even more powerful because it is a natural thing. So the FS7 and other cameras that are following in its trail are actually now showing us, trying to simulate with their dynamic range, that sort of distance between contrast, between the darker and the highlight areas, as great as we're actually able to see with the human eyes. It's very, very important. Two other quick things on the light. I've mentioned the backlight. With the backlight, the sun I would always put behind. There's another reason why I have the sun behind. I obviously model with a reflector still. But the other reason I put it behind is we don't sweat. And when you're filming somebody who's a little bit nervous, they don't squint. We don't want that either. We want to believe them. If you start squinting, you don't believe them. And the other thing to say as a camera operator, I'm shooting a lot of observational documentaries a lot of the time. And my ability to stop pull, that's where we adjust the aperture, if the sun goes behind a cloud or whatever, goes behind a building, is very key. We have to do that because the camera, with me certainly, and a lot of you guys I know will be on manual. So adjusting the aperture when the sun is behind your subject or behind the person you're filming is going to be far less than if you are flatly lighting that subject or contributor, because basically they are already in a little bit of shadow. So it's just something else to think about. And again, it's back to our technical and our story. The technical over here with our f-stops, and the story, that engagement. We are engaged by contrast. How great the contrast you want is down to you, and in particular, that thing we used to see up on the cave paintings, the story. Colour. Now, I'm going to defy a certain norm here, and I'm going to say 9 times out of 10, I never set a white balance on a white card. Yeah? I normally dial in my colour temperature. I'm going to tell you why. We have 2 common Kelvin ratings for colour temperature. Tungsten, which is what I'm being lit by now pretty much, 3,200 degrees. That's artificial light, basically. That's your downlighters in your kitchen or your office lights at work. 5,500 degrees outside, Kelvin rating 5,500, is daylight. Now, you can quite easily set between the two. What I'm arguing on my training, or what I'm going to mention now, is often we have both. And when we have both, we have a mixture of 3,200 or daylight 5,500. What do we set? I actually have a mixed light setting that I dial in, 4,500 degrees Kelvin. It means you can actually walk from a tungsten lit scene, artificial lit scene, into a daylight lit scene, and you won't need to re-white balance. And where would you put your white card on that? We can't start putting our white card in front of the contributor. You know, it's not professional to do so. And nor can we actually, when we go out, stop the whole action and bring another white card. So why not set an average? 4,500 degrees is what I set, and then off you go. That's the technical side of our railway track. That's the technical side. In terms of over here, in terms of the story, I use colour to engage. Warm light attracts. The guy I just mentioned a few minutes ago was lit by candlelight. That was a lovely warm light. He was sitting in his living room, yeah? He really is sort of happy, cozy. Warm light makes us feel comfortable. We feel content in that place. Blue light is quite a sort of, it doesn't necessarily repel, but you don't feel quite at ease that you do with the warm light. So using your colour temperature really has an effect. Again, taste the tape Monday morning, your series producer. If you'd shot that lit a little bit blue, your series producer looking at that will think, oh, okay, there's something deep and meaningful going on here. With my story with the lady that was upset because of her relationship, I shot all of that in daylight, but I shot it all about 4,500 degrees. Why? Because I just wanted to be a little bit bluer, a little bit more sort of nasty, a little bit more sort of something not very pleasant's going on here. Likewise, in the warm light, opposite effect. So using your colour temperature, dialing it in, is what I normally do, both in terms of the technical, so I can walk from different colour temperature values, and also at the same time, I'm using it because of the story. Very, very key. I'm just checking we're on the questions, but we'll come back to those in just a second. So far in terms of our engagers, we've got light, and we've also got colour. I want to show you some illustrations in just a second, because I want to talk about composition. First thing, just in terms of what we call the rule of thirds. It's basically just a grid. We're going to fade that up for you so you can have a look at it. There we go. So a lot of you will know this. But basically, I never put anything in the center of frame. It's all roughly where those 4 crosses are. Those are where our areas of interest lie. The 4 crosses indicate where our areas of interest lie. Nothing, dead center. And let me just sort of simulate to that on a photograph. This is in Angola. It's over 20 years ago now. I was there filming with the United Nations and the BBC. An amazing trip. But I just want to show you purely from what I mean by those rule of thirds and those crosses, and there's a couple of other things I want to say. You can see it's nothing of huge importance right dead center. If you're able to superimpose those 4 crosses, yes, that is a bit of a, that is a bomb, bottom right. I think they've taken the guts out of it, the fuse out of it, but one of our crosses would lie close to that. The second one would be over that row of houses disappearing off to your right. The third one, top left, would be over the house that's been bombed, and you can see it's been partly flattened. And the fourth one would be over the road. So those are our areas of interest, and in terms of our story, those are where our areas of interest lie. And you can see the couple walking past. I love this couple, the man looking over. I'm not sure whether he's staring at the bomb or me, the idiot, taking the photograph so close, but I love the fact he's nonchalantly looking over. The woman's just oblivious to it. There's 2 other quick things on this. First of all, layers. What do I mean by layers? Layers are where there are objects of interest that go progressively further deeper into your frame. So object 1 would be the bomb, and that's layer 1. Then the road, layer 2. Then the couple, layer 3. Then the verge with all the grown up, the overgrown vegetation, 4. The house that's been bombed, 5. And if you want, the sky could be 6. And why am I mentioning this? I'm mentioning this because one of the key things in terms of engagement in composition is something called perspective. Perspective is when we look at a shot or look at a photograph, look at a painting, and there's depth to it. I love looking at old Renaissance paintings, and there's often some biblical scene, a monk or something, a scribe working, and out through the window, way across the other side of the valley, you've got a church on a hilltop. That is perspective. And in particular, in terms of perspective, on this photo in Angola, you've got something called a vanishing point. Now, vanishing point, some of you may have seen on my website. I sort of go on about it, it's a fair amount. But a vanishing point is a line. It often goes on the diagonal, and it goes from one side of the picture to the other. So on the top left, you've got the broken building. My vanishing point would be all the way to the house on the far right-hand side, right down the end of the street. Right down at the end of the street. It looks smaller down there. It's actually the same side, but because it's further away, that is actually the vanishing point, taking the line away, and that is perspective. If we have a look at one other quick photo, this is one I took in the Gulf War in the early 1990s. You can see how I've used the 4 points again. This time we've got 2 on the desert, but 2 are very much in the sky. And as you can see, I've given it much more sky than I have done in terms of the desert. Why? Because of my story. Don't forget the story. The story here, basically we'd done a quick crash landing on the helicopter, and because we were down the ground, the sky to me seemed more significant because that's what had brought us down to the ground, and that hopefully was what was going to take us out. So the sky was more significant. And now you know what perspective is. You probably knew it before, but you can see my vanishing point there is the road going off. You've got the desert leading off the horizon on the right, and you've also got the telegraph poles on the far left. So we like to use perspective, we like to use vanishing points, and we actually like to use, back onto our, when we're looking at our composition, we like to use our story as an inspiration to guide us in terms of what's in our top of our frame, what's in our bottom, whatever. That rule of thirds, yeah, we divide the screen basically into 3 different blocks, and you decide what you place where depending on your story. And it works horizontally and vertically. So back to me, and I'm going to go over to my other camera over here, just to make one point. The close-up on the human face in terms of composition is one of the most important shots you're ever going to do. The eyes are the soul. The face is basically gives meaning. Whenever I'm filming my observational stuff, body language is key. Where's somebody looking? What are they looking at? Are they saying anything? Some of the best close-ups I've ever done, no one's even been speaking. And when you start applying on the close-up your light, with or without the reflector, in terms of the modeling, you start dialing in the color temperature, you go for the close-up, that's when the engagement is at its maximum. So save that for your powerful shots, save that for your powerful questions on your interview, And in my case, with the scenario I gave you with the lady by the window, when she was getting really upset, that was the close-up that I was doing at that point. We've got some questions over here, I think. Let's have a quick look. If you want to get good colour measurements on set but can't afford the colour meters, what is another option that's accurate and reliable? So is there a colour meter? There are colour meters available, and on feature films and on drama we can actually use them. As Trevor says, they can actually be quite expensive. So what I do is I'm normally, Trevor, actually doing it by eye, and that's just experience. But even if you're not that experienced, you can still work out what artificial light is, 3,200. That's to say your normal lights at home. Outside, 5,500. And if you want to go for a mix of the two, 4,500. Those are the three that we actually use. Do you have a preferred colour gel lighting kit? I'll be honest, in terms of when I'm supplementing now, I mentioned I supplement my lighting. I actually use the light panels. They are the standard now. They don't get hot. They're portable. The great thing is they have dimmers. So I don't have I used to have these horribly noisy gels, gelatine filters, which is I think what we're referring to here, used to put over. They used to get hot and smelly and they'd melt. We don't use those now because we actually dim the light. And we can also change the color temperature. So if you go for a bi-color light panel, they're normally 1 foot square. There's one behind me. You can actually dim them, and at the same time you can change the color temperature. Some people do ask me if I use Fresnel lights. They're the ones that have the lens, so the light is that much harder. And I do have a small 150 Fresnel lens. Why? Well, you saw earlier with my reflector how I like the kicker on the side of my face. A Fresnel lens is very direct. It doesn't spread the light all on different places, and it's very intense. So if I haven't got a reflector, a 150 watt Fresnel lens can be very handy. And there I would have a couple of gelatines. I might have a small ND filter, neutral density filter, to make it brighter or darker. Or I might have a slightly coloured filter. I can make it more like daylight. Standard Fresnel lens will normally be set to a tungsten light setting. So if you want to make it more like daylight, you need to put a blue filter in front of it. So we've had so far light, we've had colour, we've had composition. Two other key components in terms of our engagement. Depth of field. Depth of field is very, very close to my heart. Why? I used to be a focus puller at the BBC, and when I was at the BBC, it was my job to actually gauge how far somebody was away from the camera. And by eye, I'll have you know, I had to judge if they were 6'2" and a little bit away, or 6'2" and even a bigger bit away. And I would be judging that distance and setting it on the lens. And often I was working to tolerances of under ½ an inch, and it was tough. Initially, I didn't get it right, but as I got a reputation for it, I started to see why my DOP was using it. And depth of field basically is a region, a range, in front and behind the subject you focused on that is currently in focus. And you can manipulate that, you can change that. And if I said to you with depth of field, 80%, up to 80%, of our audience's engagement goes to what's in focus in our frame as opposed to what isn't, then you start realizing why focus is so important. On Hunted, we shoot everything very close. It's like the close-up I just showed you over there. Why? Because it's intense. There's lots of intelligence, lots of thinking going on. It's very important facts. And I've got the ability with a narrow depth of field to actually focus pull from one of my contributors to the other. What we're actually doing is metaphorically taking the audience from one plane of interest to another. We're metaphorically leading them by the hand, taking them from one area of interest to the other. Think how you could use it. I'm using it day in or day out, like shows like Hunted, but on more simple things like doing an interview. I've done another series recently with a mother, and she was talking about her daughter. The daughter was in the background in her photograph out of focus. I wanted the attention to go to the mother because the story was very powerful. But you could still see in the background, just slightly out of focus, the daughter. And at the end, when we finished the interview, I actually focus pulled from one plane to the other, from the mother to the daughter. A couple of things on depth of field, and have a try at this. I always shoot at f4 or thereabouts. f4 or under. If I'm outside and it's brighter than f4, I use my neutral density filters. f4 below, that's where your depth of field starts to kick in, particularly your shallow. That's what we're after, a shallow depth of field. You can't just do it with a wide open aperture though. You'll have to engage the zoom as well. So it's a combination of both. It's something I'm very, very keen on doing on my training. We talk about using aperture, we talk about using focal length combined to create a shallow depth of field. Of course, a shallow depth of field is also really useful when you're doing an interview and you've got a boring background, or you've actually got a background where there's lots of sort of what I call noise, but that means busy, lots of things going on. We can put that background out of focus. And that's where the cameras behind me, the Super 35mm cameras, have started to come into their own, be really, really useful. Because even before you've begun to change your aperture, even before you've begun to alter your focal length, the depth of field is naturally more shallow than it would be on cameras with a smaller sensor. So Super 35mm cameras, and we'll be looking at that in Kit Session 104, really useful. They have the downsides, of course, because often keeping things in focus can be tricky, but the majority of the time used successfully, they can be fantastic in terms of just getting you that narrow depth of field. Just going to quickly look over the question. Do you believe the saying that it's not all about the camera, it's about what you see that makes the picture? Absolutely. I'll read that again. It's so good. Should have said it myself. Do you believe the saying that it's not all about the camera, it's about what you see that makes the picture? Absolutely. In fact, next month, we're going to talk about observational filming, and I'm going to be very much pushing that concept because I'm listening and I'm watching, and I'm actually reacting to it as a normal human being, I hope, in terms of what I film. Absolutely right. And don't forget, people don't always need to be speaking for it to be the best pictures. Think about my mother again by the window. Really powerful stuff. So we've had light, we've had color, we've had composition, and we've had depth of field. The final one, handheld or tripod. You're thinking, hang on a minute, I just normally put the camera on the tripod. Well, this is why I say to you as a practitioner now, for goodness knows how long with camera stuff, I don't actually use a tripod, or very, very rarely. I did a Royal interview a couple of months ago and I used a tripod, but 9 times out of 10, I put the camera on the shoulder. Why? Because this ability just to give a little bit of movement when you're actually walking or interviewing with somebody makes your viewer, your series producer, yourself, your friends, or whoever's watching your stuff, watching your footage, make them actually feel they are there alongside that person. It's the engagement again. On a tripod, it's very formal, very rigid, which is fine if that's what the story's about. Again, we're back to the story. Over here again. What's the story about? But fundamentally, when we're doing observational or more sort of traditional documentary, we're following action around all the time, I keep the camera on the shoulder. And again, there'll be more of that next month when I talk about filming observationally. But just in terms of the engagement, it is a very key, sort of crucial way that we get that engagement is to keep the camera handheld. The other reason, just on the technical side for keeping it handheld, is it means you can move around, you can be flexible, and you can get all those different shots. On the island, they don't even see a tripod. So I train all the cast to work on the island, film on the island, it's been going out recently, and everything is shot handheld because it makes it more immediate. They obviously want to get around and get all the shots. And technically, we need to build a sequence. We'll be looking at that next month. But also, it has more engagement in terms of the story. If somebody's weeping, they haven't eaten for 5 days, that camera just in there slightly unsteady gives us more of an engagement than it would on a tripod. I'm just going to check and see if there's any quick questions. Yep. What do you consider as the perfect shoot? I'm not quite sure what you mean by the perfect shoot. If it's the perfect shot, then I've already indicated I like using all these components we've spoken about. They are all key and fundamental. I would go so far as to say, back to my railway track, that if you just do the technical, if you actually just expose it, focus it, get your camera level, we're only doing half the job. It's over here. That's what's going to get you your next job, using the camera to tell a story. Using the light, using that contrast, using the reflector. Not always using a white card, but dialing in your color temperature. Composition, think about it. Don't just film somebody against the flat wall. Move them around a little bit. Often I've moved my camera 6 inches one way, 6 inches the other, and the whole background is transformed. Suddenly I get a perspective. Sometimes I get a vanishing point. Depth of field, another perfect shot. What's in focus and what isn't. My attention going to, my audience's attention going to what's in focus. And then finally, as I say, handheld or tripod. If you blend some or all of those together, that series producer on a Monday morning is going to be engaged. When he or she gets into the office, takes their coat off, sits down, they will want to look at your photos, look at your footage, look at your images. They will be emotionally engaged. I often say on my training, some of the best homework you can actually do is look at your own footage, or look at a colleague's footage, or even just look at your best favourite documentaries footage. Turn the audio down or even off, and just see how they've used the components we're talking about, how they've done it. Does it engage you? Does it make you laugh, cry, angry? Does it make you think about those shots the day after, the year after? That's what we're after. That engagement, that's the science of what we're trying to do with our camera. That's why using a camera to tell a story isn't just the technical, it's all the emotional stuff over here as well. That emotional, subconscious engagement. Thank you very much for listening. We've gone a little bit over the half an hour, but I hope you managed to bear with us. We're back in a month's time when we're talking about filming observational sequences. I call it filming the chaos. So we're talking about sequences, camera on the shoulder all the time, how we make everything cut, how we make everything manageable, particularly where we point the camera. But that's next month. Do stay in touch with us. Email us if you want with any questions. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.